Okay. HaMitzvah Kuf Tzadivov. HaMitzvah Sheish V'Sishim Umeya. He shetzivonu lahanik eved ivri kishyetze lechovshi. When he's on his way out of servitude, you're supposed to give him presents. V'lo yetze b'yadayim rekonos. A double talk and in the negative. V'amra yis'aleh hanek tanik lo mitzomcho migonecho mikvecha shebeach Hashem elokecha titen lo.
Stop talking, I want to hear you. Stop talking.
Now, let's get started. One thing at a time. The Rambam in the Rambam quotes this Mishnah right after the Mitzvah of Tzedakah. And the question is this mitzvah basically tzedakah or something else? Or is it a schar? So if it's an in of tzedakah, we understand the placing of the Rambam. It's not clear how important the placing of the Rambam is in general, but things may be better. The Shach seems to clearly say that this is tzedakah. In Mishpat Siman Pei Vav, Sifkot and Gimel Rambam Meforish Ba'almo B'chol Mil Tzedakah Go in Ma'isa Oni V'Shat Tzedakah Nami Lo Yisir Lekreb Not Hanka Hu Midin Tzedakah Ukiremash B'Kra Psuka Mashma like that Ub'Shas Perek Elu Metzias Ub'Kiddush Maduchte. So he takes it as a clear, the clear way of understanding this, the clear proper perspective on Anok that it's tzedakah. The chinuch also in Mitzvah Tov Pei Beis, V'Kel Hateiv Chofetz Lehetiv LaAmoy V'Odenu V'Hoidu V'Had V'Hadoroi Hadnu Hu Shenerachem the Rabbeinu Shenerachem Al Mi She'ovad Odonu V'Neitein Loi Mishalonu B'Teiras Chesed Milvad Ma She Hisninu Imoy Lo Seis Loi B'Schora. So the Anokah is Chesed. The Gdula Shanun Aleph Chelik Aleph Ois Hey Hoira Kosov Tezeh Lo Shaykh El B'Choyv Gomo K'Goyim Ba'alvo or Yafilu B'Schiris De Almo Shehi Chelef Malachtoi Shetoach. If it's wanted, Yeshalov Chiv Tashlum V'Lo B'Teres Chein V'Chesed. Avo B'Hanokah She'eno El B'Derech Hanino Omer Teira the Avagav the Schir the Sochir Mikre, even though he's called. He's working by hours or by days. Because it's a matona, it's not a choyv. The smaso ain't a nokel levedim. B'teres chiyu, it's not b'teres chiyu, b'teres vito or matona or b'teres chanino. The problem is the Mishnah Melech. The Mishnah Melech has a suffix in Perek Gimel of Hilchai Avodim Alocha Yudalit. He says, Voran, Beperek Nam Mispatato is Pshita, that Anocha Yod Min the Chosev, the Lego Mitzvah, because he holds all stock is Yod Min the Chosev. He comes sapkali who ali b'derashbo. The sirle de b'tztoko loy nachtin el nichse. But only for chayv in nachtin. Gabi anoka mao. Is it a chayv in nachtin el nichse, or is it like stoka? Mao. The efshe anoka who didn't chayv yeshlo. The boho Soch scha kai rachmon. K'nechsi ki mishes chasochir. V'nachtino v'nichse al dilmo v'dome v'tztoko. V'dove tzorch Talmud. So I would have assumed from the Rambam, it's not a raya, but the way he puts it would assume that it's a type of tztoko. Then we continues. It says, "Shetivono lahanik eved ivri kishietze lechovshi." So in Kapach, he adds two extra words. She lahanik eved ivri v'la'azolo kishietze lechovshi. So this is very odd. I didn't see any reference to this in the Talmud or in the Rambam. There's a din to help the Eved Ivri. There's a mitzvah to give him matana, but I didn't understand what this is talking about and what the issue is and what these words mean. Now, this is not only by Eved Ivri, but this is also by Omer Briya. The Ram clearly says that in Minyan HaKotzer, in Kuf Sadivov, Lahanik le'Eved Ivri shenema Hanik Tanek loy v'chulei v'chein la'Omer Briya. The Makor is more Kedushin and Yuzayin Beis. The Ram has it in Per Gimel, Milchos Avodah Malochi Gimel, that he clearly says that it's also by Omer Briya. And Rav Hai going, Rav Sadi going, his Minyan HaMitzvos is also in Omer Briya. V'Yehudia v'Eish Shichuam Yikabalu Manak. They should have a present. Adono Yitein Loi. Now, the next words are interesting. So we know there's a mitzvah by Eved Ivri and Eved Ivri and Omer Briya to give a matana b'shas shichur. The Ram continues and says something which is very odd, which I'm not sure I understand what it means. Okay, he says the following. He says here, "V'lo yetze b'yadayim rekonos." They shouldn't go out empty-handed. So the question is, what is this? Not to go out empty-handed. Is it Aseh? Does it not say that it should have a to go out with presents? And is it Aseh to go out empty-handed? V'omo yis'aleh hanek tanek loy. So the v'omo yis'aleh also goes on this. So maybe you should read it. Kilos and Aseh. We know there's a lav, and if we're saying besides there's a lav, there's also an Aseh. The Ram, however, in Mishnah Torah doesn't mention anything about an Aseh. Kol Meshayach Shalech Avdoi v'Amosai Rekom Oive B'Loi Saseh Shenem Lo Shalchenu Rekom v'Akol Aseh Shenema Hanek Tanek Loi. There's a nita Aseh. So here things are becoming very strange, and I think the first thing we really have to do is try to understand what lava nita Aseh is. A priori, I would have said that a lava nita Aseh means that the Aseh was given to the lav, and prior to the lav, you can't imagine an Aseh, and you can only imagine the Aseh with the Averis halav. After when you violate the lav, that comes in a mitzvah Aseh. So if you learn like that, it's very difficult to imagine there's an Aseh, because if the Aseh only comes into being after the Averis Halav, so you didn't violate an Aseh when you sent it out Chinom, but you are incumbent. You have to, at the point when you violate the law, it's incumbent upon you to mekayim the aseh. So then, you can't imagine any aseh if you learn like that. We'll see in Mitzvah Hashem in the midst of Havei Tavitenu, things will become very interesting. But let's assume like that for the moment. So then you should say that in Mishnah Torah, where he clearly says that it's a lava nitil aseh, therefore he doesn't mention an isaseh, because the lava nitil aseh means that after you violate the lav, there's an aseh. There's no isaseh. You're supposed to do an aseh. But here, however, in Minyan HaMitzvos, the Ram say that HaNek Tanek is a lava bomb, is a lava nitel aseh. And maybe his opinion is that there's an aseh. This because the way he formulated it, because yetze lechovshi v'lo yetze b'yadayim lekonis, the lahanik loy. So lahanik loy yetze pshutai means that at the moment that he sends him out, he is obligated this mitzvah. So I can imagine that if he sends him out b'chinom, he violates a lois aseh and an isaseh. So what I'm trying to suggest is maybe that the isaseh only exists in Minyan HaMitzvos because he doesn't have any expression of a lav nitel aseh, and the Gemara doesn't say one way or the other is lav nitel aseh. The Rambam, the Mishnah Torah says lav nitel aseh. So certainly there's no isaseh. That would have been very interesting and very nice. And then it would be very interesting that we remember you have in Shiur Shishi, you have a few different types of cases with an aseh or lois aseh. One case is the aseh and the lois aseh b'dova echod, like Shabbos. There's a mitzvah aseh from Shvisa Malacha and a lav of doing malacha. And then he has a case of an aseh before a lav, like an only supposed to marry the woman and you're not allowed to divorce her. And then there's the opposite case. There's a lav, and then there's an aseh, like by Yishlu Hakan. So maybe in Sefer HaMitzvos, this is in the category like Shabbos, where there's a mitzvah say of melacha, of shvis melacha, and a lav of doing melacha. That all would be very nice. However, just going against that before we examine Havei Tavitenu, I'm not sure we'll do it now. Maybe we should hold it off. But it's a little odd because in Pirush HaMishnah, in Reish Perek Gimel, excuse me, it's just the opposite. The Rambam, when he mentions the Lava Nitel Aseh, he gives some type of a list. He doesn't say it's an exhaustive list. Does not mention Anoka. So you can say that's his Chiddush in Mishnah Torah, and therefore Mishnah Torah falls off the Aseh. It could be very, very nice. We're going to have to see, and the problem will be in the return of the Mashkin, whether you can imagine a Lava Nitel Aseh, whether the Aseh, it can exist before the Averis Halav. But simply, everything sounds very good. Now, let's do it again. Since we started out and we suggested that the reason why the Rambam puts this mitzvah right after tzedakah, that is an inyan of tzedakah. So I ask myself the question, if that's true, maybe the Rambam should not have counted it as a separate mitzvah, but maybe it should be part of tzedakah. And you could also look at it a different way. Not only maybe it should be part of tzedakah, maybe it should be part of the mitzvah of Eved Ivri and not a separate mitzvah. I'll explain to you what I mean. Because the mitzvah of Eved Ivri, the way he formulates it in Mitzvas Aseh, Shlamet Beis, he shetzivonu bedin Eved Ivri. It's a very nondescript mitzvah. It's the din Eved Ivri. So I can tell you another one of the din is that you should send them out with a matana. V'oma yisale ki sikne Eved Ivri. Min hakotzer lo dun bi Eved Ivri kil chosoi. Kenem shema ki sikne Eved Ivri. The Protei mitzvahs, he says, din kinyan Eved Ivri. So maybe you should limit it only to the kinyan. But that's a little bit convoluted. Why limit it to the kinyan and say this is not part of the mitzvah? Make it broader and say it's part of the mitzvah. Because on the other hand, maybe say the mitzvah is not, maybe the mitzvah is not the kinyan, but the mitzvah is lisnaheg be Eved Ivri with the dinim in the Torah. The same way the Ram has the mitzvahs tumah is lisnaheg with the mitzvahs tumah, with the dinei tumah, like the Torah has in the Torah mentioned. It could be like also. So you can ask a question, why is this separate mitzvah? And the Rambam's going out of his way. He puts the din Eved Ivri together with the mitzvah of dinim, and he puts this together with tzedakah. So here you can say something, and if it's correct, it's certainly interesting. You see, if it's correct, okay, and the mitzvah is really how we deal with an Eved Ivri, okay, at the moment that you free the Eved Ivri, he is not an Eved Ivri anymore, okay? So you have to ask yourself, is it mistaber that there should be, I can imagine all the dinim that apply to an Eved Ivri, even after Kinyan, should be part of the mitzvah of the Eved Ivri. But the question is, would you logically put the dinim of what happens with the shichra when he's an ois Eved Ivri as part of the mitzvah Eved Ivri? And you have to ask yourself that question. And then there's another way of looking at it, but I'm not sure that that's correct. The question is, if there's a peculiar mitzvah tzedakah which exists only at a certain time with an Eved Ivri, would that make it a separate mitzvah? Or you put it under the general, and we have to understand, we'll see other mitzvahs like that, when we get involved in Oinor, whether it's Oinor Lager or not Lager, we'll see exactly how that works out. But at the moment, there's this issue, and it's a very interesting issue. Why did the Rambam count Hanek Tanek as a separate mitzvah? Now, let's just think for a second, okay? If you're of the opinion that Hanek Tanek is a lava nitik laseh, then you're in easy street. Because if you recall, the Rambam in many cases says that lava nitik laseh is a raya, it's a mitzvah. Because the Rambam learned that the nituk has to be with a kiyum of a mitzvah aseh. And when Chazal say that it's a lava nitik laseh, they're actually clearly saying that there's a mitzvah aseh over here. So that's very good. But if you're of the opinion, as we suggested before, that the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos is of the opinion it's a lot of lava, not lava nitik laseh. In fact, he doesn't quote this as a raya. He just says very simple that she's born lahanik eved ivri k'shiyetze lachavshi. So we're back to the question of why should it be a separate mitzvah, and you might have to fall back on what I mentioned before. In Mishnah Torah, there's no problem. And you could just add a little bit that basically the mitzvah of Eved Ivri are your obligations, or the kinyonim of the Eved Ivri are dinim. Stokah, by definition, is not a din. It's an expression of chesed and chanina. So I'm wondering, maybe you could not have put this as a din, and by definition, it had to be out of the purview of the din Eved Ivri, and it's a type of a mitzvah stokah and a separate mitzvah. That I think would be very interesting. We have to explore that, mitzvah. The question is, another question. Why is the Rambam so graphic quoting this pasuk? Usually he's mekatzer, and here he says, "Hanek tanek lo mitzonecho migonecho mikvecho asher berach Hashem elokecha titen lo." So he doesn't give you a clue here, but maybe he's trying to merames that in this pasuk is encapsulated many of the dinim of Hanek Tanek. And you'll find that you could have just written Hanek Tanek Lo, and that's it. In Hilchos Avodim, Gimel, Halacha Yudaled. Hanek Tanek Lo, Mitzonoch Migonoch Mikvecho, Be'inon, Inyan Tzayin U'Geiren V'Yekev. Dvorim Sheyesh Lo Bohem Brocha Machmas Atzmon. They have within themselves, they can expand to become larger and greater. Yekev, Geiren, Tzayin, to have children. Hu Shechayev Lahanik Lo Mehem. Something which doesn't grow, which cannot have it within a bracha, eino chayev litain lo mehem. So the mitzvah hanek tanek is dover sheish boy bracha. Kames noisein loy ein pochers mishav shleishim sela bei momoin bei mi minecho bei mi hal bei minim kishleishim knas hoevet shnema ki yitain lav doinov. Ben shnizborach habayis beglolo, ben shlo lizborach. Shnema hanek tanek lo mikomoka. The obligation is to give lefi habracha. That is the mitzvah of HaMitzvos TANK, and the assumption is that we're working that it is a type of stalker. Then, if that's correct, the next mitzvah, Kuf Pei Zayin, could also be another type of stalker. And the Lashon of the Rambam over here seems to point in that direction. HaMitzvah, HaSheva, V'sishim Umeya. He shetzivonu lahalvois laoni. The mitzvah halvo in Kesef Talves Ami is not to Chaim Yankel and Shmerel. It's only to an oni. To make life easier, that he can breathe and move ahead in life and not fall under. Umitzvazo, hi hayoyse chazoka v'yoyse muchuyeves mikol mitzvos stoka. It's the greatest and the zenith of stoka. So then, this would support that HaMitzvos is stalker, because to talk about discussing about this is the greatest mitzvah stalker, and to say the mitzvah stalker, and then to say HaMitzvos TANK, which has nothing to do with stalker, and then say here's the greatest mitzvah stalker in the case of Talvis Ami is very odd. This would support the argument before that the Ram is trying to say that HaMitzvos TANK is stalker. Let's just read it and then we'll go through and try to understand it. Ki mi shenizbaze, you see, let's just say it and then we'll read it through. There's a psychological fact over here that the Oni, the first time he goes out and sticks his hand out, for him, psychologically, there's a disaster. He felt that he's not human. He lost his identity. He's just a beggar. The second time, difficult. The third and fourth time, he's a pro. Fifth time, sixth time, no problem. The person who's asking for the loan has not reached the point of sticking his hand out and asking for matanis. And this is what the Ram is describing. Kimi, and we'll see Kapach's translation also, Kimi, this is first Ibn Tibban, Kimi shenizbaze v'gola fonov lisho midei ho'anoshim, someone is already a pro at sticking his hand out and asking for money for people, ain't soras inyonoi. It's not psychologically devastating to put his hand out for stalker. K'moi hamachuse, the person who never did it before, sheyitz leozer ad shelo yiskal inyonoi. He, when he asks even for the loan, it's very psychologically very difficult for him. And he knows what the repercussions are going to be if he's not successful in procuring the loan. Achelo yizgale inyonoi. V'lo yizbaze. Now, let's see here. Kapach says, "Shenizbaze." Excuse me, sorry. The Kapach says, "Shenitzrach v'gola fonov levakesh b'bnei Adam." He's known as a needy person, and he was megal himself. ein mitzukosei v'tzaroi, the cycle, the devastation, the dire straits that he's in, the dovazeh, are not k'mo shadayin legol uponov hazokuk le'ezra. He has yet to become public, and he is potentially, with all the anxiety, devastated. He's going to have to stick his hand out. Kedei shelo yizgala matzovoi v'lo yehei nitzrach. Vatzivui b'mitzvah zo hu amo yisale im kesef talve es ami es heoni imoch. The mitzvah is to an oni. Okay, let's stop here, and we'll take up Lineda afterwards. The second half of this, the mechilta. So there's a mitzvah to give a loan. Okay. Now, I just want, before we go on, if you recall, the Rambam's definition of tzedakah is to someone equal or less. Okay? So I can imagine most of the gemach, just want to tell you just this to spin it the proper way. Most of the people who are coming to loans in gemach are not close to the riches of the person who gives out the loan. So I'm not sure, he has to look with a microphone. If he wants to kind of mitzvah test of Talvis Ami, probably anyone who's coming to the door, there will be a mitzvah. However, certainly it's clear in the Rambam, this is Oni. The Rambam says it here. He says, Lahavos La'oni, and Mina Kotze, in Aseh Kuf Tzadizayin, Lahavos La'oni, Shemikesef Talvis Amis Oni Imo, Ese Oni, V'chule. Mitzvahs, Hilchos Ma'aloiva, Lahavos La'oni Umoch. So, I guess Moch, I'm not sure if it's a Vav Mechaber or Vav Mechalik, but the person Moch is about to fall apart. Okay? V'chein b'luchos Ma'aloiva, Perek Al V'lochal, Mitzvahs Lahavos La'niya Yisrael, Shemikesef Talvis Oni, Es Ami Es Oni Imoch. Now, interesting here is the tour. The tour in Chosh Mishpat, Siman Sadi Zayin, says the following: Vafilu Oshir Shetzol Little Voice Mitzvah LaHalvoise Lefi Shah. So, what you could have done over here is Lefi Shah is almost like an Oshir Shalev Mekoymoi. He doesn't have as much time zuz, so maybe this Lefi Shah. He's an Oni, this Oshir is an Oni Lefi Shah. However, the Achreinim don't go like this. The going in Chosh Mishpat in Siman Samach Zayin, Sifkot and Beis, Vafilu Oshir, he says the Makor is Bob Mitzia on Oshir. The Gemara asks, the Gemara discusses an Oni and an Oshir, who is first? Midioma that the Oni is the Oshir. When you have an idea of Kedima, both are a mitzvah, but one is a greater mitzvah. So the Goin says, you see from here, there's a mitzvah to give a loan to an Oshir. So the guy says, but Metzia Shom, Ani V'Oshe, V'chule, B'Ri'oma, Koidem. So you see that there's a mitzvah. That's, I'm just adding in a few words. This is B'Ri'oma, Ani, Oshe, Koidem. Then he says, Sukkos Mem Tesam Beis. Okay, so let's see, but Metzia and Sukkos, and see what the guy is trying to tell us, I hope. But Metzia, Ayin Aleph, Omid Aleph. The Tonu Rabbi Yosef in Kesef Talves Ami es Oni Imoch Ami V'Nochri Ami Koidem Oni V'Oshir. So the Goyin assumes that Oni V'Oshir, Oni Koidem means the Kiyum in the Oshir also. It's just the Oni's first. So the going to go Eisen here, there's a mitzvah to give a loan to an Osher Kfilat Tzorach. But the question only is there Raya? It's a mitzvah in Kesef Talves Ami. Because there's Esa'oni Imoch. Because maybe what the Gemara has in mind is that the mitzvah is a mitzvah of Gemilas Chesed, as that's what maybe what the Goyin means when he calls the Gemara in Sukkah, Mem Tesma Beis, Stoka Laniyim, Gemilas Chasodim, Bein Laniyim, Bein Lashirim. So the Gemara has a fine line that there's no Stoka Tashirim. Ubora, the Sefer of the Rambam. Then you could say there's no mitzvah of havor to an oshir, but it's a mitzvah of Gemilas Chasodim. V'after le'ach kamoicha, the Ram Perek Yudalet of Ilchos Ova Halacha Aleph. So there's no mitzvah of Kesef Talves Ami to an oshir. The same way, there's no mitzvah to a goy of Kesef Talves Ami. And the same way the Gemara says, Oni, it says like this, it says, Ami v'nochri, Ami kodem. So it might be, or it might be a mitzvah of Kesef Talves Ami. But when you come to Oni v'Oshir, so the Gemara says that the Brisa says that Oni is before, because I say in Oni you have a kiyum of both Gemilas Chasodim and Kesef Talves Ami, the Oshir don't have it. The interesting thing would be, and I'd rather not comment on this, that in the Oshir Lefi Shah, that he's about to be moch. I'm not sure the Gemara is talking about such a case. I'm not sure how you evaluate who and how you decide to give your loans. Next. So the Chera, when the Rambam is graphically saying that for Mitzvah Stoka, I'm not sure if he gained something, he lose something. Because the more he says is the greatest of Mitzvah Stoka, I would have said, let it be part of Mitzvah Stoka. Unless you're ready to take a peculiar type of Mitzvah Stoka, it is a separate mitzvah. I'm not sure I would have bought into that. Now, let's just see what's going on here. The Rambam in Perek Yud, Halachas Zayin of Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, Perik Yud Halacha Zayin. Shmone ma'alos yesh b'tzedakah. Shmone ma'alos yesh b'tzedakah. Zo l'mayla mizo. Ma'il gedola she'ein l'mayla mimeno ze hamachzik b'yad Yisrael shemoch v'noisnein loy matona oy halvo. Someone who's about to declare bankruptcy, who's about to fall apart. Hamachzik biyad Yisrael shemoch v'noisnein loy matona oy halvo. Oy oisi moshutvis mamtil amlocha chazik es yoda shel yitztarach labiyos lisho. He doesn't have to come to this place. Yalzeh nema ve'chzakta boy v'chayimoch. Kloi mahachzik bo shelo yipo v'yitztarach. So this, in one hand, sheds light, and on the other hand, it confuses it. I'll tell you why. It sheds light because you understand that this is the greatest mitzvah stalker. But if it's the greatest mitzvah stalker, then you have to do it because v'chzakta boy. And it's not a separate mitzvah. It's part of mitzvah stalker. So, how do you do this? Okay? So this becomes very strange. So now, before we try to attack this question, I like to continue further and look at the Vatzivui. Let's continue reading the Rambam. Let's go back. Vatzivu b'mitzvah zo hu amra yis'ale in keset talves ami esa oni imoch. V'loshen ha'mechilta in Parshas Mishpatim kol im v'im shebatera rishus chutz mishloisha echad mehem eternal. So it means, if it happens, you don't have to do anything. But there's 3 times in the Torah it says im, and there's a chayva. And one of them is in Keset Talves Ami. Amru. Im Keset Talves Ami. Atoime chayve oinu el rishus. Talmuloima v'havet tavitenu. They machsoiroi. So you learn that it's a chayva below rishus. Okay. So that is the mechilta. So the question is, why is he quoting the mechilta? So I could have suggested that the Rambam is bothered by this question. Maybe this is not a separate mitzvah. And the mechilta is a raya, then it's a separate mitzvah. The problem with that is that then the Rambam says himself. Because in mitzvah chof, the Rambam has v'im mizbach adomo taseli, and the mechilta here also quotes that it's a chayva, because it quotes mizbach abonim taselach. But however, you have to keep in mind that the mitzvah of mizbeach, even though it's mentioned this mechilta as one of the 3 ims, it's not a separate mitzvah. It's not a separate mitzvah. It's part of the mitzvah of Binyan HaMikdash, as you recall in the Rambam in Mitzvah Chof. So l'cheira being mentioned in the Mechilta of calling it a chayiv is not a new reason why it's a mitzvah in Minyan HaMitzvos. You have to evaluate it on its own merit. On the other hand, you can flip this around. Let me go like this. Why does the Mechilta start with Kesef Talvis Ami and bring a proof that it's a chayiv? Why don't we start Have Tavitenu and there's a mitzvah of giving a loan, a mitzvah of giving a loan, and it's a chayiv, and there's no im, and you don't need the im. So maybe you could take a position, and here it's going to get very murky. I'm not sure we'll get to it, the murky part today, but the simple you could say, no, that Have Tavitenu really is it's not a mitzvah's halva, b'teres halva, it's b'teres stoka. And that's what the Seder Parshas would show. And there's a din day machseroi, and the same din day machseroi which is said in stoka was said in the Have Tavitenu, and it's a became stoka. And this is the way the parasha goes. Ki yiyeh b'cho evyoin me'achad achecho bi'achad shorecho bi'artzecho asher Hashem Elokecho noisen lecho lo yisametz es levovcho v'lo yistikv yodcho me'achecho evyoin me'achicho evyoin ki pasoach tiftach es yodcho loy v'have tavitenu dei machzero sheyechsaloi. In one sentence, it basically is talking about stoka. And you could suggest that maybe, that the Ram could not have quoted Havi Tavitenu, because Havi Tavitenu, the Ram really doesn't quote Havi Tavitenu in Mishnah Torah except to prove that it's a chayva. However, even before you start to think about this, the whole parsha is very odd, because we continue after this. It says, "Hishama lecho pen yiyeh dovo im levovcho b'li'al leimo chov shnas hasheva shnas hashmita v'ro eincho b'yochicho v'evyon v'lo yisitein loy v'kol olecho el Hashem v'hoye b'cho chet nosein titein lo v'lo yero levovcho b'sitcho loy." כי בגלל הדבר הזה יברך השם אלוקיך בכל מעשה ידיך ובכל משפח ידיך. So what are we talking about? If you look over here, let's go back. Let's go to Malva. Perik Aleph Halacha Aleph. Lahalvos laoni Yisrael shenema im kesef talve es ami es oni imoch v'chule. V'atera hikpido al mi sheyimna milahalvos laoni shenema v'ro einecho v'yochicho evyoy. And what's he going to do? He's not going to give the halva from the Have Tavitenu. That's what the Pasha goes. Ki pasuach tiftach yotcha v'havei tavitenu lo de machzeo shiechslo. Hishomer lecha pen yedovim levavcha bliyal lema kol shnas hashem shnas hashmita v'oinecha. So l'chayra this din and he quotes this in Ilchos Ma'av. So you would have said that this part of the Pasha, the Havei Tavitenu, is the din avor, and this is the mitzvah. So we're back to where we started. Then, on the other hand, and also it's very clear that we're talking about avor and not stalker, and this would support this approach that we're not talking about stalker. I said we're talking about stalker. Havei Tavitenu is the mitzvah stalker. They machzerah. Because there's another problem. Do we find in halva there's a din of de machzerah, or it's only stalker? When a person comes for halva, is their mitzvah yoda masekes loy to give de machzerah sheyechselo? So I could have imagined it's only in stalker. But if you say the Havei Tavidenu is really the mitzvah halva, you get a new din of de machzerah in halva. But the problem is, it's the Chamufush pasuk, and the Rambam Mishnah Torah doesn't mention any place that there's a mitzvah of halva la'oni with de machzerah in the mitzvah in Hilchos Ma'av. On the other hand, in Shemitah v'Yovel, it's very clear that this is halva. Perek Tes, I mentioned this I think last time. Perek Tes halacha lamed. Mi shenimna milahalvois es chaveroi chidem hashmita shem yisache achoiv sheloi v'yishamek. There should be shmita over b'leisasa should be shamelacha. V'hoisav hakosav lahavos shelo yimne el yiten shenem anosin titen loi. So we don't know what's happening over here, but I'm even more confused. This halva that he's talking about over here, is this an oni or even an oshir? In Hilchos Shemitah v'Yovel, look at the lashon. See, in Hilchos Ma'av he says clearly we're talking about an oni. And when he talks about in general, so we're talking about halva to an oni. However, when you look in Shemitah v'Yovel, in Perek Tes halacha lamed, mi shenimna milahalvois es chaveroi koydem hashmita shema Yisacher hachayiv shaloi. Does he say it's an oni and oshir? Mahalvas chaveroi. But the whole reason why he's not giving the loan is because he's afraid he's going to lose his money because of Shmitas Ksofim. V'yishomed ova v'leisase shenem yishomer locho v'ayhoisiv v'chul ayhoisiv hakosav lahazir l'tzavois shelo yina el yitein shenema nosin titein loi. That's what he says. Just 1 second. Here, see, here we're not even talking about the mitzvah of how. So it's very difficult to imagine you can actually medayik from the parsha what we're talking about. Just 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So you guys, shlo yimna melahavos koidem hashmita kidei shlo yalvad b'moinod. So it's interesting. This nothing titain that he quotes over here, I could have imagined it's a separate mitzvah, especially if you learn that it's going on in Asher also. Hoisiv hakosu lahazir ulitzavois shelo yimne el yitain shenema nothing titain loy v'loyelu levavoy. So what happened exactly? So there's an Aseh counted in minion. So the Chayr Nosen Titin Loy is a separate Aseh in Shemitah to give the Halvah. But if you say that includes even an Asher, the Chayr could have imagined it's a separate mitzvah minion on mitzvahs. So I'm very confused. On one hand, the Steamer's Halosh and his Mash is even an Asher, but he says L'tzavois, and he doesn't say it's a separate mitzvah. And Al Yelu Levovcha B'Sitchaloi is the Ram quotes that in Malvoleva. So I could imagine that it's talking about only an Oni. So this is very confusing. We have here a lot of confusing issues. According to the Rambam, what's the mitzvah? What's the Raya that it's a separate mitzvah? Maybe it's part of the stalker. And just the various sukkim in the parsha, what are they talking about? Are they talking about a halvah? Are they talking about a mitzvah stalker? Interesting, Sadi Goin flips the world upside down, and he says you derive the mitzvah of halvah to an ani from the pasuk Have Tavitenu. In Sadi Goin, in Minyan Mitzvas Shaloi, Perek Yud Gimel, page 103, B'chayiv lahalvois Kama sheniskak kasher hadovo. Oh, see here is kama sheniskak. See, we know the day machzore. So he's very good. The Ram doesn't have that. Kasher hadovo efshori. It's kafi heseg yodo. Kafi heseg yodo. You have to give day machzore. Kamo she'omroi v'have tavitenu. And it's like stocker because the Torah said it in one phrase together with day machzore. But a day machzor in halvah and a day machzor in stocker. So this I understand. In Rambam, we need a lot of work to try to understand why it's a separate mitzvah and how it's a separate mitzvah, and to understand whether before Yovel there's a mitzvah only to give a halvah to an ani or even an asher. The Yovel shouldn't be a separate reason to give a halvah to an asher. There's no mitzvah, so there's no mitzvah. So why is Yovel more mechayev? The Ram should have said something. B'ez Hashem, next week, Bli Neder, there are two difficult mitzvahs coming up. One of them is about rivers to a guy, which is amazingly difficult. And the other is about Lahashiv Mashkin. And that is also very difficult because we'll have to understand here, you'll be able to begin to understand Lavanitul Aseh and whether it requires logically that the Aseh cannot exist before the Lav or at the time of the Lav. Okay, have a nice week. Atzlocha.